We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Joe Stiglitz, who's a university professor of economics at Columbia University, Nobel Prize winner. He's done path-breaking work in any number of areas in economics. He's also been heavily involved in policy debates in both the United States and around the world for more than 3 decades. He's quite likely the most famous economist in the world. So we're very happy to have Joe here with us today. Thanks for joining us, Joe.
Nice to be here.
Let me just say, we're doing this audio. We're not trying to hide from you, but we had some technical problems, and Joe's very busy, so we just want to go ahead and take advantage of what we can do. So this is straight audio. It's not your problem. It's our problem, not yours, and it's unfortunate that we have to do it that way. Anyhow, so what I want to start with, Joe has a recent book out, his most recent book, I should say. It's not that recent, Road to Freedom: Economics and the Good Society. And I want to just start out. Let's talk a little bit about, I'll ask Joe, what do you see as, kind of the most important aspects of that? It's a broad-ranging book, but what do you see as the most important aspects of the themes you're trying to hit in the book?
Well, the reason I wrote the book was that a concern that those on the right seem to have uh, grabbed a hold of the notion of freedom as almost as if it was their own property right, but they didn't understand freedom. Uh, I wanted to explain what one should mean, what really concept of freedom meant, and it's approaching a little bit as an economist. It's what you're free to do. And somebody at a point of starvation doesn't really have freedom. He does what he has to do to survive. And the freedom on the right also doesn't understand uh, the ways in which one person's freedom can encroach on that of others. So your freedom to carry around an AK-47 may encroach on my freedom to live. Your freedom to not get vaccinated uh, takes away my freedom not to get a disease or not to go to a hospital or even to live. So, in a interdependent society, uh, freedoms are not absolute, and what if implicitly people like those who belong to the Freedom Caucus on the right are prioritizing some freedoms over others. And I think most people would say it's more important to live than to have the freedom to carry an AK-47. More important to live, have freedom to live is more important than the freedom not to be vaccinated. So I think they've just gotten things backwards.
Yeah, it's striking, and it's often been, I'm sure, frustrating to you as well as to me that in many of these debates, I think, people we might think of as on our side of the debate, that they often, I think, have allowed them to have this freedom. And, the vaccine debate, I think, was a great example because it's, to my view, and I have no idea what your particular position on this is that, I go, someone said, I don't want to take the vaccine. I'm going to live off in the country and not see anyone, I'll have someone else bring me my food or whatever. I'd say if that's really how you feel. But what the concern, my concern is, we want you to get the vaccine because you're in school, you're going to stores, you're interacting. You could give the disease to other people. So it's not just, you don't like the vaccine, you think it's going to kill you, whatever you think, but what you're asserting as your freedom is in effect the freedom to infect other people. And the analogy I always made was drunk driving. If you want to drink, go ahead and drink. I mean, it's bad for you, but you want to drink, go ahead and drink, but don't go driving where you could threaten someone else. And that was
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That those are all examples. I put it rather unpoetically. One person's freedom is another person's unfreedom. Uh, Isaiah Berlin, who was a great philosopher at Oxford, put it, I think, more poetically when he said, freedom for the wolves has often meant death for the sheep.
Yeah, yeah. I should probably mention for, our listeners might not all be as old as we are. The Road to Freedom is a reference to Hayek's book, Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, which was exactly in the opposite direction. Um,
Exactly. The title was a ripoff of his. He wrote his book in 1944, uh, where in the aftermath of Keynesian economics, where Keynes and others had shown that we didn't have to have a Great Depression where 1 out of 4 or 5 people was unemployed. The government could intervene to stimulate the economy and get us back towards full employment. And it was a period where both in Scandinavia and the UK, there was the beginnings of the welfare state, saying that people didn't need to die because they couldn't get access to health care. We could provide health care for everybody. It was the beginning of National Health Service. And he was worried that this uh, increasing size of the state was putting us on, setting us up for authoritarianism. And that's why he called it the road to serfdom. And as you just said, he got it 180 degrees wrong. You don't see authoritarian populism growing so much in countries where governments have done too much, like maintain full employment and provide basic foundations of health and food and so forth. You see authoritarian populism in places like the United States. Where the government's done too little.
Yeah, and again, getting back to the concept of freedom that you put forward in the book, if we think of it as the freedom to, do things, be able to live a good life, however people interpret that, that means, obviously, the food you need, getting access to healthcare, and of course, education, getting, opportunity to get a decent education. And, these are things that obviously the government plays a role in. We could argue how much, how exactly, how best to do it. But the idea is that we have a responsibility to ensure that everyone has, kind of these basic needs that allow them to live a good life. And without that, what does freedom mean?
Absolutely. And one of the other themes of the book is that there are circumstances where a little restraint, a little regulation, a little coercion can actually expand freedom for most people in a meaningful way. An example I give is traffic lights. In a city like New York, if you didn't have traffic lights, you'd have gridlock. Well, traffic lights are a regulation. They're a restraint. You say you can't go until you get the green light. But as I said, in the absence of traffic lights, nobody can move. So a little restraint can expand everybody's freedom.
Yeah, no, it's a great example because we often talk about how the government has to make the rules of the road, and that's literally the case with the traffic light. Our streets wouldn't do us any good if everyone could just plow through intersections, and we're having traffic accidents all the time. And yeah, that's certainly a lot of regulations have that form. Um, we also, and again, you talk about this in the book, but one of the big issues, of course, it comes up in any number of different contexts, is externalities. And here too, I've been frustrated again with the way many people talk about it. Like it's optional whether we deal with externalities. And to my view, it's this is an issue of how you define property rights. So if I build a home somewhere and I tell my neighbor I'm just going to dump my sewage on their lawn, I go, okay, well that's my freedom. And obviously my neighbor's not going to like that, and we don't allow that, but we understand that that would be an externality that I'd be expecting my neighbor to absorb. But it's the same sort of story when we think of pollution that it's we understand I can't just throw my sewage on my neighbor's lawn, But this is another externality. It's how you define property rights. So if you just say I could throw stuff in the water and the rivers and the atmosphere, and that's not my problem. That's an odd notion. I mean, some people would say that's freedom, but it's a little hard to see that.
Yeah, I would just give one more example of where illustrating how a little restraint can actually, in a meaningful sense, expand everybody's freedom. Not that long ago, we had COVID-19, a pandemic. The reason that we got over that pandemic as quickly as we did was we developed the mRNA vaccine. We developed that vaccine so quickly because we had developed before the pandemic the mRNA platform. Uh, how did that happen? It just didn't happen like manna from heaven. We spent money doing research. We provided support for researchers at University of Pennsylvania, other places, and so we were ready when the COVID-19 happened, when the pathogen appeared. Well, when you think about that, that took resources. Where does that resources come from? From taxation. Taxation is coercion. But if you ask the question, what is the trade-off here? A little coercion to pay a little taxes, or your freedom to get out of the house as a result of the fact that we finally contained the pandemic as a result of the vaccine? Well, I think most reasonable people would say, I'd rather have a little coercion, pay the taxes, and have my freedom to move around, my freedom not to be hospitalized, my freedom not to die. So that's another example where a little restraint actually expands freedom.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. And again, it's one where kind of the history, at least by some people, has been sort of rewritten where, the story that some will tell is, well, the government locked everything down. And there was that period, it was at the state level, of course, but, from the middle of March till, again, varying by state, through April into May, in some cases June, where you did have legal prohibitions on people going to restaurants and, gathering in other places. Those were mostly gone, though, by the summer. And still, again, I've looked at the data, people were not going to restaurants. They were not going to movie theaters. They could legally go there. No one was going to arrest them for that. They could legally be open, but no one was going to go there because they didn't want to risk getting the pandemic. And, even if they thought they were relatively healthy and, could probably get through it, which true, if you're in your 20s and 30s, that's probably true, but you have friends, you have relatives, you don't want to get your parents sick. So most people weren't doing that. So that wasn't the government prohibiting it. It was people recognizing that this was a serious pandemic and they didn't want to take the risk themselves and certainly risk exposing their families. So it was a very concrete example where, their freedom was seriously impinged by the pandemic. And again, the government was the less important factor there for, again, 2 months, 3 months. The government did, no dispute there. It did put bans on people, restaurants being open and, other places like that. But that was a relatively short period. In a much longer period, again, the data speaks for itself. You could see restaurant sales were way down until well into 2021 when most people were able to get the vaccine and felt more secure going out and risking seeing people.
Exactly. So it shows you that uh, a little coercion, a little collective action can expand people's freedom, and that's basically something that those in the right don't fully understand or appreciate.
Yeah, no, and it's a really fundamental point. Again, it's just frustrating, and we've all been frustrated when, we should be able to agree on a set of facts, and it's just unfortunate when you have Again, I would never defend everything that was done in the pandemic in terms of, the closings. They were shooting in the dark, so there's, getting everything right, of course, was impossible, and different countries, different states did differently. But the basic point was, was certainly on the mark. And again, the data speaks for itself. It was people's decision not to go to restaurants, not to go to movie theaters, not to go to concerts or whatever else they might have done and encountered a lot of other people. So it just, as I say, it's a rewrite of history, and obviously it's serving if you want to make the claim the government does everything wrong, but that's just not true. People weren't doing these things because they didn't feel safe.
Uh, that's right.
So let me, again, we could spend the whole time talking on your book, which is a lot of material in there, and this is related, obviously. I want to go a little bit into the issue of markets and inequality. And, we know you could have inequality in markets, but one of the things, you've emphasized, and I've learned a lot from your work in this in different areas, that, how we structure the markets and how much inequality they generate is very much a matter of policy. We could structure them differently and have less inequality, or structure them the way we do now, and at least in the United States, and have an awful lot of inequality. So, do you want to say a little bit about ways you think that, important mechanisms for, limiting inequality, or, making it more extreme, as the case may
Sure.
be?
Let me first begin, just to repeat what you said, that the language I've used sometimes is to say inequality is not a result of the laws of nature, it's the laws of man. Inequality is a choice, and it's a choice we make through our policies. Uh, One of the things that I've emphasized is that to extent that we don't often fully appreciate that the distribution of market income is a result of a whole set of uh, laws, regulations that may not seem directly related to inequality, but have the effect of leading to more or less inequality. Let me give you some examples. Some of these are pretty obvious, yet we often don't focus as much as we should on the inequality consequences. If we don't have good competition laws, if we allow monopolies like we've done, uh, this does two things. The monopolies make enormous amount of profits, and monopolies tend to be owned by very rich people, and that leaves money to going to the top, concentrations of wealth at the top. But at the same time, that monopoly power often leads to higher prices. And what does it mean, higher prices? It's lowering income, real incomes of those down below, of ordinary workers. So when we say more money is going to the top, that's equivalent to less money going down below. It's increasing inequality. So uh, competition law is both about making the economy work better, but it's also about curtailing inequality. Uh, Labor legislation is a little bit the same. Adam Smith actually talked about this. Uh, Corporations have just so much more power than ordinary workers unless workers get together, say in form of unions. So if you don't allow unions or you make it difficult to unionize, there's an imbalance of power, and that leads to more inequality. Recent research has shown that the effect of lack of worker bargaining power leads workers to be getting about 30% below the competitive wage. And what does that mean? Wages are lower. That means profits are higher. Again, more inequality. So the legislation that's been passed over the last 40 years, which made it harder to unionize, easier for employers to force disputes into arbitration, a whole rash of policies have undermined workers' bargaining power, including some of the regulations related to globalization. So that's a second example. Bankruptcy laws, we don't normally, we think of those as sort of arcane rules that lawyers are interested in, not about inequality. But there are two things recent bankruptcy laws over the last 25 years have done. One of them is uh, when a company goes bankrupt, a financial institution, first priority goes to derivatives, uh, enhancing uh, uh, the derivatives market. Well, what is that about? That's money at the top. Uh, on the other hand, if you go into bankruptcy, the one debt that cannot be discharged is student debt. So you can discharge debt for buying a yacht, but you can't discharge the debt because you're trying to get ahead and you take out a student loan. Well, that means impairs the ability of increases the risk of taking out a loan, makes education more difficult, increases the burden on ordinary workers who've had misfortune. Uh, it's an inequality increasing policy. So embedded in our bankruptcy law is a pro-inequality policy.
Yeah, I'll throw a couple more things in there with bankruptcy because I've become sort of obsessed with it lately. One other one that was very important in the collapse of the housing bubble was that mortgage debt could not be renegotiated in bankruptcy. So if I owed 200,000 on my home, most other debt could be renegotiated. So if I have 20,000 credit card debt, the judge looking overseeing the bankruptcy goes, well, this person doesn't have 20,000, how about 10? And the credit card, whatever. They could do that. But if I had 200,000 on my home, what the judge's choices were in most states, it varied by state, but in most states, they'd say, okay, you either lose your home or you find a way to come up with the 200,000. And there's nothing natural about that. You could write those bankruptcy law. I mean, again, we allow it for credit card debt. Why don't you allow it with mortgage debt? So that's, again, it's very much how you choose to construct the law. And this is again nerdy detail that very few people follow, which means it's often written, for the interest of business. But the other point I'll make is, again, because you brought it up, I'm going to pick on this with bankruptcy. I mean, a lot of private equity is about exploiting the bankruptcy laws. So the standard practice for a private equity firm is that they buy up these companies, load them up with debt, they sell off their assets. So if they own land, it's very common if they own, you have a private equity company buys up a retail chain, they sell off the land, and then they have the chain that is paying rent every month. They build them up with debt and pay that to themselves, the private equity partners. And then if it goes into bankruptcy, they just go, well, that's the company, don't talk to us. Now you could just
Exactly.
written
And
you
they pay out the profits as dividends quickly so that they're not sitting inside the firm. They're already in the pockets of the owners of the private equity.
exactly, exactly. So you could just write the bankruptcy law that says if you control the company and it goes into bankruptcy, you're responsible for the debt. I mean, you can argue what's the better way to do it, but there's nothing inherent about bankruptcy law that says you could set up these companies as totally, treat them as independent when they're not. I mean, that's the whole point. They're literally under the control of the private equity company. But we let the private equity company put them into bankruptcy and then just walk away from it.
Yeah. So, clever lawyers, and America's had a lot of clever lawyers, take advantage of these details of the rules of the game to take advantage of others. You might say exploit others who don't fully understand all of what's going on. And so, as you gave an example of the private equity, they walk off with a lot of money, and everybody else is left holding the bag.
Yeah, yeah. And again, what's, to my mind, really fundamental here is there's nothing here in the market that says, and we could obviously argue what's the best bankruptcy law. but the market isn't writing the bankruptcy law. We have politicians writing the bankruptcy law, obviously with being influenced by a lot of people who stand to gain or lose, it's not, that's not given to us by the market, and you get very different outcomes if you'd written the law differently.
Exactly.
So let me take to another area where again, you've written extensively and I've learned a lot from your work, and also a major source of inequality, intellectual property. That here too we have this idea, or at least many people have the idea that kind of we have patents, copyrights, trademarks, and they're just facts of nature. And in fact, they're not. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And let me go back to COVID-19 because that's so visible in our mind. Um, the government paid for most of the basic research. The government paid for most of the applied research that took the mRNA platform and brought it into a vaccine, and then brought that vaccine into production. And even though the government had paid for almost all of the research, they allowed Moderna and Pfizer to walk off with a patent and to make monopoly profits. It was worse than that. They didn't put any conditions on these companies as they uh, took this intellectual property that had been largely produced by government research. And they said, you have the right to stop people in other countries getting access to this vaccine. And so we had what was became called vaccine apartheid, where U.S. and Europe could get as many vaccines as they wanted, but people in the developing countries, even if they had the money, just couldn't get access to it. Um, South Africa and India asked for a waiver on that intellectual property rights. Interestingly, uh, the concept of a waiver of a compulsory license had been supposedly embedded in the uh, TRIPS agreement, which was the intellectual property agreement of the WTO, but it was done in a way that allowed, again, going back to the law, allowed the drug companies to drag their feet so that it would take years. Of course, in a pandemic, you don't want to wait years to get the vaccine. You needed it now. And South Africa and India and other countries had the capacity to produce it. So our drug companies, Pfizer and Moderna, and deliberately restrain access to the medicine, leading to we don't know how many thousands of people dying, hundreds of thousands being hospitalized. Uh, what was the trade-off? Their profits versus the lives, well-being of millions in developing countries. They show just unbounded selfishness and uh, were successful in vetoing the waiver at the WTO.
Yeah, there's several things about that. They're just so infuriating. First off, just to emphasize the point, you already made it, but it can't be emphasized enough. This was totally an artificial shortage. So it's not that we were even asking, Pfizer, Moderna to give anything to anyone. Just let them use it. Just don't get in the way.
And
So,
can I
and
add one more thing? They were willing to
sure.
pay royalties on it, but that wasn't good enough for them. They wanted monopoly profits, not just royalties.
Yeah, yeah, no. So we literally prevented them from getting it. And again, in terms of externalities, it's when you did not allow India and other countries to have the vaccine. Of course, it spread. We got mutations. How many strains might we've avoided? Had I mean, to my view, what would have been the rational thing to do, and you could even done this simultaneously, would to be immediately share the technology. And this is again, I was not party to any of these debates, so I don't know if this ever came up, but you could immediately share the technology and just say, okay, everyone could use everything. Put it on the table, share the technology. We have experts here, and experts in other countries too. They, can go around help in India. They have sophisticated pharmaceutical industry, so we're not going out in the sticks and showing someone with, sticks and rocks. And these are very sophisticated manufacturers. Show them, give them whatever technology you've learned that they could do it quickly, and worry after the fact about who gets paid what. So you could still give a ton of money to Pfizer, still give a ton, but those two can go on simultaneously. You could have the argument about who gets what were the right procedures, what were the right royalties, at the same time that you shared the technology so that you could stem the pandemic as quickly as possible. But that was not what was done.
Yeah. If we had any sense of public spiritedness on the part of these drug companies, that's what they would have done. 100 countries asked for this. And we even succeeded in getting President Biden's support, waiving the intellectual property for a vaccine, but we didn't succeed in getting him waiving it for the therapeutics. But we couldn't get Germany and UK and Switzerland to go along because of the influence of the drug companies.
And this is again a big part of the story of inequality that we were talking about earlier, because the profits go to someone. We all were paying more for the drugs, and obviously beyond just paying, this is people's health, people's lives. So it was really huge in this case. But it's a case where you had a lot of people. I saw Fortune had a piece a couple of years back. How Moderna had created, I think it was 6 billionaires. And this is, based on technology. As you said, it was largely funded by the U.S. government, our taxpayers. We gave them the patent, and as a result of that, you had people getting very rich based on, a vaccine that U.S. taxpayers had basically paid for its development, or certainly the bulk of its development, and these people walked off with huge amounts of money.
Absolutely.
And and again, I always pick on Bill Gates as my example of inequality in intellectual property, because here's a guy who's got I don't know where his fortune is these days. I know it's well over 100 billion. Certainly one of the richest people in the world. It doesn't really matter what the exact figures are, and it rests entirely on the fact that Microsoft could have someone arrested for making unauthorized copies of their software. And again, this is do you have patents? Do you have copyrights? You could argue that, but where how extensive they are, how strong they are, how long they are. These are all policy choices, and you can't say that was just the virtue of the market. There's
Yeah, let
actually
me emphasize one aspect of that, which is that there was a combination of using intellectual property rights and anti-competitive practices. So you intellectual property rights gives you monopoly, but even when you have a monopoly, it doesn't mean you have to engage in uh, every anti-competitive practice you can think of. But we didn't do as good a job as we could have and should have in restraining the anti-competitive practices that monopoly allowed him to engage in.
Yeah, and again, he actually did. There was a famous case, of course, the antitrust case against Microsoft, which they originally lost. I guess you could still say that they had a verdict against them, but the original the judge who presided over the case originally ruled that Microsoft should be separated. On the one hand, you'd have the operating system would be a freestanding company, and then all the others, at that time they were selling, auxiliary softwares, that those would be a separate company. and that got they appealed the original ruling. It got turned to another judge, and she ended up making a much more modest change to Microsoft. So, but it was both that they did have obviously intellectual property, and again by the court's ruling, both courts ruled. The judge didn't overturn the ruling; she just made a much more modest sanction for Microsoft.
That's right, and that illustrates. They were found guilty of anti-competitive practices on three different continents, but in the end, we never uh, effectively addressed the appropriate remedies to make the market more competitive.
Well, I appreciate you having taken the time. I know we're coming up against limits. So let me just ask, is there something you'd really like to say? I got you here, and is there a point that you think is really important to make that we haven't had a chance to get to in the time we've had here?
Well, I want to emphasize the positive side. We've been talking about a lot of things that have gone wrong. One of the main themes of my book is another world is possible. Politics are difficult, but there are alternative ways of organizing our society. I call it progressive capitalism. Other people might refer to it as a rejuvenated social democracy that can make for a better performing economy where an economy that's more sustainable, but in which the fruits of that economy are more equitably shared. This is a major change in the way we think about the world. It used to be that we thought if we wanted to have more equality, we'd have to sacrifice economic performance. Now we realize that the two can go hand in hand, especially because so much of inequality is a result of market distortion, market exploitation, of the kinds that we've been talking about, things that actually undermine economic performance. And if you have large parts of the population who don't have the access to resources, the education, the health, the nutrition that they need to be as productive members of society, there's no way society can perform as well as it can live up to its potential. Um, One of the hopeful notes at this particular juncture is that South Africa is now chairing the G20, and it asked me to chair a commission of experts in inequality. And our main recommendation is the creation of an international panel on inequality, a little bit like the IPCC, independent body of experts. IPCC, experts on climate. These would be experts on inequality to help inform the global community about trends, drivers, consequences, what can be done about the problems, just like the IPCC did. I met with President Ramaphosa in New York and in Cape Town, and very strong endorsement. We've been getting very strong endorsement from international organizations, from experts on inequality, public policy figures, from some governments. So I'm very enthusiastic about the possibility that maybe inequality has gotten so bad that the world is waking up and realizing that we have an inequality emergency, like we have a climate emergency, and they'll come together and begin the long task of trying to do something about it.
Well, that's a great way to end. I try to be an optimist too, and I think there are grounds for optimism. I'm glad you mentioned that. So, Well, thanks a lot for joining me, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.